For decades, whenever someone has met a deeply narcissistic adult, the same question has hovered in the background. What did the parents do? What kind of childhood produced this? We have built an entire cultural script around it. The cold, distant mother who never showed warmth. The father who placed his child on a pedestal so high that the child grew up believing the world should bow. The household where love was conditional, performative, or absent. Therapists have written about it. Self-help books have built empires. Social media is saturated with it. And the message has always been the same. If you are dealing with a narcissistic person, look at the parents. The parents made them this way. But before we accept this familiar narrative, we have to ask, what if that story we've all been telling ourselves for nearly a century is fundamentally wrong? A massive new study, drawing on data from thousands of twins, their siblings, their parents, and even their romantic partners, has just delivered a finding that is forcing psychologists to reconsider almost everything they thought they knew about how narcissism develops. And the finding is not subtle. It is not a gentle tweak to the existing theory. It directly challenges one of the most dominant assumptions in personality psychology. According to this research, the shared family environment, the broad parenting style, the warmth or coldness of the home, and the household's values contribute almost nothing to whether a person becomes narcissistic. Almost nothing. In fact, the data even hint at something so counterintuitive that the researchers themselves urge caution before discussing it. So if parenting is not the cause, what is? And why have we been so wrong for so long? In the next several minutes, we will walk through this study carefully, step by step. We will look at how narcissism is actually defined in modern psychology, why the old theories took such deep root, what the new research actually measured, and what the results mean for how we should think about narcissistic people in our lives, in our workplaces, and in our families. Before we go further, let's clarify what narcissism is. The word is now so overused that its meaning is dissolving. In casual talk, anyone a little self-absorbed gets called a narcissist. But in psychological research, the trait has a much more specific meaning. Narcissism, as researchers define it today, is built around three interlocking features. The first is grandiosity, an inflated sense of one's own importance, abilities, or specialness. The second is a sense of entitlement, the belief that one deserves special treatment, recognition, or privileges that others do not. The third, and perhaps the most important from a motivational standpoint, is an intense drive to acquire social status, admiration, and prestige. People high in narcissism are not simply confident. They are magnetically drawn toward being seen, admired, and above others. Crucially, this trait is not purely negative. Researchers have found that narcissism carries what they call adaptive consequences, as well as maladaptive ones. On the adaptive side, narcissistic individuals often appear confident and charismatic in first impressions. They tend to do well in early dating, in initial popularity contests, and in the climb to leadership positions. They project an aura that draws people in. On the maladaptive side, the same traits lead to overly risky decisions, interpersonal conflict, dissatisfaction in long-term relationships, and organizational disruption. The very qualities that help narcissistic people rise tend to be the same qualities that eventually create chaos around them. Narcissism is compelling because it is stable. Once present, usually by adolescence or early adulthood, it persists for decades. People don't drift in and out of narcissistic patterns. The trait sets and stays. That's why understanding its origins is so important. If we figure out how narcissism starts, we have a better chance of understanding and mitigating its impact. For most of the 20th century, the dominant explanations for narcissism all pointed in one direction: the family, specifically the parents. Two main theoretical traditions have shaped both academic and public understanding. The first comes from psychoanalysis. According to thinkers like Otto Kernberg and Heinz Kohut, narcissism develops as a kind of compensatory armor. The theory goes something like this: a child who grows up with cold, emotionally distant, or unloving parents experiences a deep wound to the developing self. To protect against that wound, the child constructs a grandiose, inflated self-image, an image strong enough to defend against the pain of feeling unseen. This idea evolved over time into what is often called the mask model. The narcissistic adult in this framework is wearing a mask. Underneath the bravado and the entitlement is a fragile, insecure, vulnerable self that was damaged in early childhood. The second tradition takes the opposite view, but lands at the same destination. Learning theorists, including more recent researchers like Eddie Brummelman, have argued that narcissism develops not from cold parenting, but from excessive warmth, specifically from parental overvaluation. When parents constantly tell their child that the child is exceptional, special, superior to other children, deserving of more than others, the child internalizes that message. The child grows up believing it. The pedestal becomes part of the self-concept. So the two top academic theories disagree on the mechanism. One says cold parents create narcissism, the other blames overly indulgent parents. But both agree on one thing: parenting is the engine. The home is the origin. Change the parenting, and you change the trait. This view is not just academic. Nearly every popular discussion on narcissism assumes it. Open any best-selling book on narcissistic personality, scroll through any therapy-adjacent corner of social media, listen to any podcast on toxic family dynamics. The story is always the same. The narcissist was made by their parents. The childhood home produced the adult. It is an intuitive story. It feels right. It explains why families seem to repeat patterns. It gives us a target to point at. And for that reason, it has gone largely untested until now. Here is the problem that researchers have been pointing out for years, even if it rarely makes it into the public conversation. Parents and children share more than just a household. They share roughly half of their genetic material. So whenever we observe that narcissistic parents tend to have narcissistic children, we cannot simply assume that parenting caused it. The resemblance could just as easily be explained by inherited biology. This is what researchers call genetic confounding, and it has haunted family research for decades. If you look only at parents and their biological children, you cannot tell whether a trait runs in families because of nurture or nature. The two influences are tangled together at the genetic level. The clean way to separate them is through twin studies. Identical twins essentially share all of their DNA. Fraternal twins share, on average, about half of the genetic variants that differ between people in the population, as do ordinary siblings. If a trait is heavily influenced by genetics, identical twins should be much more similar on that trait than fraternal twins. If a trait is heavily influenced by the shared family environment, both kinds of twins should be similar to roughly the same degree, because both kinds grew up in the same home with the same parents. Earlier behavioral genetic studies of narcissism existed, but they had real limitations. The samples were often small, the methods were narrow, and they did not account for some important real-world complexities. One of those complexities is something called assortative mating, the tendency for people to choose romantic partners who resemble themselves. If narcissistic people tend to pair up with other narcissistic people, the genetic math behind classical twin studies starts to get distorted, and the results can be misleading. To get a true answer on where narcissism comes from, researchers needed more power. They needed a bigger sample and multiple types of family relationships to compare. They also needed to include parents, not just twins. Their statistical model had to handle assortative mating, the influence of grandparents and broader genetics, and the subtle interplay between genes and environment. That is exactly what this new study set out to provide. The research, led by psychologist Mitja Back at the University of Münster in Germany, along with his collaborators, drew on data from the remarkable Twin Life project. Twin Life is a long-running, large-scale German study that follows thousands of twins along with their siblings, parents, and partners. It is one of the most comprehensive extended twin family datasets in the world. For this particular analysis, the team worked with a final sample of 6,715 people. That sample included identical twins, same-sex fraternal twins, the non-twin siblings of those twins, the mothers and fathers of those twins, and the spouses or romantic partners of the adult twins. This is the kind of sample size and family structure that allows for genuinely powerful comparisons. You can ask, for instance, how similar identical twins are compared to fraternal twins. You can ask how similar parents and children are. You can ask whether romantic partners resemble each other in narcissism. And by comparing all of those patterns simultaneously, you can mathematically separate the genetic from the environmental contributions in ways that simpler studies cannot. The participants fell into 3 age cohorts. One group was around 15 years old, another was around 21. The third was around 27. This spread allowed the researchers to test whether the influence of genetics and environment changes across adolescence and early adulthood, a question that earlier theories had left open. The narcissism measurement itself was carefully chosen for each age group. Adolescents responded to items adapted from the narcissistic personality inventory with statements about feeling like a natural-born leader, being a special person, being good at getting others to do what they want, and finding it easy to control other people. Adults responded to items from a measure called the Naughty 9 scale, a refined short version of an earlier instrument. They rated statements about wanting others to admire them, wanting others to pay attention to them, and seeking prestige and status. Both scales tap into the core motivational features of narcissism, the hunger for admiration and the drive to stand above others. The researchers also took several methodological precautions. They used latent variable modeling, which is a statistical technique that helps correct for random measurement error. They tested whether the measures behaved consistently across different family members and ages, and they pre-registered their hypotheses on the open science framework before running their analyses, meaning they publicly committed to what they expected to find before they looked at the results. This is a standard of transparency that strengthens confidence in the conclusions. To make sense of the results we are about to walk through, we need to understand how behavioral geneticists divide up the influences on a personality trait. They essentially split the variation among people into 3 buckets. The first bucket is genetic variance. This refers to the proportion of differences between people that can be traced to differences in their inherited DNA. If a trait is highly genetic, identical twins who share all of their DNA will be very similar to each other on that trait, while fraternal twins who share only about half will be noticeably less similar. The second bucket is the shared environment. This is the bucket that captures everything siblings experience together in the same household: the family's socioeconomic status, the neighborhood, the school district in which they grew up, the general parenting philosophy, the warmth or coldness of the home atmosphere. If a trait is strongly influenced by shared environment, then siblings raised together, regardless of how genetically similar they are, will tend to resemble each other on that trait more than unrelated children. The third bucket is the non-shared environment. This is the bucket that contains everything individual to one person and not the other: a specific friend group, a particular romantic relationship, a unique teacher, an accident, a piece of luck, a workplace dynamic. Even within the same family, 2 siblings can have radically different individual experiences, and those individual experiences fall into this third category. The whole point of an extended twin family study is to figure out how much each of these 3 buckets contributes to a trait, and the predictions of the dominant theories of narcissism are very specific. If the traditional theories about parenting are correct, the shared environment bucket should be substantial, because the parenting style a child receives is something siblings in a family share to a meaningful degree. If parenting is the cause of narcissism, the shared environment should show up clearly in the data. So what did the data actually show? The result, replicated across measures, across age cohorts, and across multiple modeling approaches, was startlingly clean. Roughly 50% of the differences between people in narcissism could be explained by genetic factors. The remaining roughly 50% could be explained by the non-shared environment. And the shared environment, the bucket that includes broad parenting, family atmosphere, household values, family socioeconomic status, the home environment writ large, contributed nothing, essentially. Let that sink in for a moment. The home environment, the very thing that virtually every popular and academic theory has pointed to for nearly a century, accounts for close to zero of the variation in how narcissistic people become. The pattern in the data was unmistakable. Identical twins were strikingly more similar to each other in narcissism than fraternal twins were. That is the classic signature of a highly heritable trait. If the shared environment had been doing real work, the gap between identical and fraternal twins would have been much smaller, because both pairs grew up in the same homes with the same parents, but the gap was large, and consistently so. The researchers also looked at how parents and their children resembled each other in narcissism. And yes, they did resemble each other. But here is the key piece. Once the statistical models accounted for the shared genes between parents and children, the environmental contribution from parents to children was not just small, it was negligible. In some analyses, it actually turned negative. That is, after the genes were accounted for, the broader behavioral environment created by narcissistic parents was associated very slightly with less narcissism in the children rather than more. The researchers themselves are extremely careful about how they discuss this finding. They do not claim this proves that narcissistic parents somehow inoculate their children against narcissism. The effect is small, the data have limitations, and the interpretation requires care. But what the finding does mean, beyond a reasonable doubt, is that there is no positive environmental transmission of narcissism from parents to children. The popular idea that narcissistic parenting produces narcissistic children, transmitted through the behaviors and habits of the parents themselves, is simply not supported. It is hard to overstate how much this complicates the standard narrative. For decades, we have been telling a story in which the narcissistic adult is the product of a specific kind of childhood. The data suggests that the narcissistic adult is, in genetic terms, the product of inherited biology plus a long string of individual experiences outside the home that the data cannot directly observe. So let us be clear about what these results actually say about parenting, because nuance matters here. The findings do not say that parenting is irrelevant to a child's life. They do not say that loving, attentive, secure parenting has no value. Parenting clearly shapes many aspects of a child's psychological life, including a sense of safety, attachment patterns, language, initial relationship to authority, and more. The study is not making a sweeping claim about parenting in general. What the findings do say is much more specific. When it comes to the particular trait of narcissism, the broad parenting style that siblings in a family share does not appear to be the engine that creates the trait. Narcissistic parents are not transmitting narcissism to their children through their parenting behaviors. Cold parents are not creating narcissism through coldness. Indulgent parents are not creating narcissism through indulgence, at least not in any way that the shared family environment can capture. This is a hard finding for many people to sit with, because it pulls the rug out from under a story we use constantly. When we encounter a deeply narcissistic person, we want a clear explanation. We want to know what happened. We want a villain or a wound to point to. The traditional theory gave us that. It told us, look at the parents, look at the home, that is where the answer is. The new research suggests the actual answer is messier. Roughly half of the explanation is encoded in DNA, in inherited biological tendencies that neither parent nor child chose to give or receive. The other half is woven into a vast collection of individual experiences spread across an entire life. The friend group in middle school, the first romantic partner, the way a particular boss responded to early career achievements, the workplaces that rewarded status seeking and the ones that did not, the specific moments in which someone learned that a certain way of presenting themselves got them what they wanted. There is no single villain in that picture. There is no single wound. There is biology, and there is biography, and the family home, surprisingly, is not the main stage. While the central finding of the study challenges traditional theories, a secondary finding deserves its own moment of attention, because it cuts against another piece of common cultural wisdom about narcissistic people. The researchers found clear evidence of assortative mating. In plain language, this means that romantic partners tend to resemble each other on this trait. Highly narcissistic people tend to end up with other highly narcissistic people. People who are less narcissistic tend to end up with less narcissistic people. The partners in the study were measurably similar to each other in their levels of narcissism. This finding directly contradicts a widely held piece of folk psychology. The idea is that narcissists deliberately seek out submissive, weak, or unusually empathic partners as targets to exploit. The narcissist is predator, the partner is prey. It is a story that gets repeated everywhere, often by well-meaning people trying to warn others about toxic relationships. But the data suggest that the dominant pattern is not predator-prey. It is matching. Like attracts like. Two people with strong status drives, similar levels of grandiosity, and similar appetites for admiration find each other and pair up. This pattern has another consequence worth noting. Because partners are similar in narcissism and because narcissism is substantially heritable, the children of two narcissistic parents inherit genetic predispositions from both sides. Over generations, this kind of partner matching can subtly increase the genetic component of trait variation in the population. It does not mean narcissism is exploding across the population. The matching effect is moderate. But it is one more piece of why narcissism appears to run in families. Not because of how the parents raise their children, but because of who the parents chose as partners in the first place. Going into the study, the researchers had a specific expectation about how genetics and environment might shift with age. There is a well-documented pattern in personality research that as people grow up, they become more autonomous and increasingly capable of selecting environments that fit their inherited tendencies. A genetically gregarious teenager grows into an adult who chooses social careers and surrounds themselves with friends. A genetically introverted teenager grows into an adult who carves out a quieter life. Through this process of choosing one's environment, genetic differences tend to amplify over time. The team expected to see a similar pattern with narcissism. They predicted that the genetic contribution to narcissism would be larger in adults than in adolescents, as young adults gain the freedom to seek out the kinds of social and professional environments that fit their underlying tendencies. Interestingly, the data did not support this prediction. Yes, there were some descriptive differences between the cohorts. The genetic share looked slightly higher in the 21-year-old cohort than in the others, for example. But statistically, the differences across the three age groups, 15, 21, and 27, were not significant. The proportional contributions of biology and individual experience stayed remarkably stable from adolescence into early adulthood. This is a useful finding in its own right. It suggests that the basic balance of nature and nurture in narcissism is set early and holds steady. Whatever is going to express itself genetically is already expressing itself by mid-adolescence. Whatever individual experiences will shape the trait are already at work by then. So when we ask whether narcissism is the parent's fault, the most accurate answer the science can offer right now is mostly no. The resemblance between narcissistic parents and narcissistic children is real, but it is not running through the parenting. It runs through the genes, through a partner matching process that subtly stacks those genes generation after generation, and through a life the child will go on to lead in friendships and relationships and workplaces that no parent fully controls. This is not a comfortable conclusion. Comfortable conclusions are rarely the ones that move a field forward, but it is, as far as we can tell, the closest thing to the truth, according to the most rigorous study yet conducted on the topic. Narcissism runs in families, but mostly because of biology, and because of who narcissistic people tend to choose as partners, not because of how those partners then go on to parent their children. If you have spent years carrying a particular story about why someone in your life turned out the way they did, this research is an invitation to hold that story a little more loosely, not to abandon compassion, not to dismiss the role of upbringing entirely, but to recognize that the human beings around us, including the most difficult ones, are shaped by forces wider and stranger than the simple formula of childhood equals destiny. Science does not always give us the answers we expect. Sometimes it gives us the answers that quietly rearrange the furniture of our understanding. This is one of those moments. And the next chapter of narcissism research, the chapter the authors of this study are now urging the field to write, will not be about parenting. It will be about brains, hormones, peers, partners, careers, and the long winding path of an individual's life. That is where the answers The real answers seem to be hiding.